The next group we want to deal with is one which often comes across within the New Testament perspective, but one which we don't often take note of because we don't really understand the difference. The group that I'm referring to are in fact the Gentiles. Now, a Gentile for the Jew was really anyone who wasn't a Jew. A Gentile was those people who were outside of the Torah, outside of the chosen people. And of course, the Samaritans form that grey period, or that grey area in between. But the Gentiles were those who didn't become part of the covenant, who weren't part of the covenant, who weren't part of Torah. In fact, the Jews went so far as to say that anybody who therefore was outside of the covenant were unclean. Now, this is something that's developed during the period post the exile. So once the people come back from exile, there's this emphasis that begins to happen. And you see some of it within the books of Ezra, for example, where Ezra encourages the Judeans who come back into the Holy Land to actually divorce, and to the people who are still there, is to divorce their Gentile wives, to divorce their Gentile husbands, so that they may retain a sense of purity. And so we can already see that right from that time of that return from exile, there's this emphasis on ethnic purity. And ethnic purity is really not about ethnicity, but an ethnicity that arrives out of their Judaism, out of their religious perspective. And so therefore everybody outside of that becomes known as a Gentile and becomes, by virtue of that, unclean. The clean ones are the ones who are part of the covenant, who are part of Torah, the unclean ones being all those who are outside. Jesus seems to have no real problem with the issue of clean or unclean. He doesn't seem to have any problem with calling or dealing with calling people unclean or clean. Rather deals with people as people, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their religious affiliation. We see him traveling into Gentile areas. So the north of Israel was a Gentile area. We hear about the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Both of those were cities in what was called Phoenicia. Phoenicia was an area which looked after a lot of sea trading and seafaring in the earlier times. In fact, the times even before the Romans, they were known as the main traders within the Mediterranean. They also believed that they were the ancestors, or at least they were the people who established a major empire in North Africa called Carthage, which is round about Libya today. So that area was the area in which they were developing. And in fact, the Carthaginian Empire is most well known for one of their generals, a man by the name of Hannibal. And it was Hannibal who actually, through Spain, was able to take his elephants across the Alps and into northern Italy, where, of course, he was defeated by the Romans. But he's well known, and it's that empire, the Carthaginian Empire, which in fact gets into a war with the Roman Empire. They're called the Punic Wars. And it's in the end of the Punic Wars that the Romans actually destroy, in fact, completely and utterly annihilate the Carthaginian Empire. And the Romans take over that part of North Africa. But in this period, the Romans are in control. They've taken over this part as well, that this part of Phoenicia is also part of the Roman Empire. But essentially it is a Gentile territory. On the east side of the Sea of Galilee is also a Gentile area called the Decapolis. Decapolis meaning the 10 cities. And it's named that because of the 10 cities which made up that area. And so we often hear Jesus talking about going across the lake, and he goes across the lake and into this Gentile area. And he's able to go and, for example, heal the demoniac. The man who was demon-possessed was there on that side of the lake. We also see the feeding of the 4,000. And the feeding of the 4,000 happens on the other side of the lake. Obviously, the 4,000 there are not Jews, but rather Gentiles. A very important thing if we're going to understand the difference between the feeding of the 5,000, which happens on one side, and the feeding of the 4,000, which happens on the other. And so we see the Gentiles play a very strong role within the concepts of the Gospels. Later on, of course, in the book of Acts and also in Paul's writings, we see that the Gentiles are the ones that Paul himself feels driven to go and spread the gospel to. However, in fact, in the book of Acts, we find that the first Gentiles to become Christians are, in fact, converted not through the work of Paul, but through the work of Peter. which is again ironic. And in many ways, I think Luke wanted to show that because he was writing to an audience that was Jewish, and so wanted to show that Peter, who was the stalwart of Judaism, actually was the one who was the first one to bring Gentiles into the Jewish perspective, or in fact into the Christian perspective. But we see that in fact that first conversion didn't change everybody's mind, even Peter's for that matter. Because we read in the book of Galatians, for example, or the letter to the Galatians, that the problem that had happened in this diaspora environment of Christianity was that the Jews were insisting that the Gentiles first become Jews before they could become Christian. And it's Paul that stands strongly against that, saying, no, that's not the case. In fact, Jews and Christians come together. Whether they're Gentiles, whether they're Jews, is irrelevant. Christianity now is that next phase of Judaism. And therefore you don't have to first go and become part of the whole ritualistic and cultic version of Judaism in order to become a Christian, in order to actually acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. Rather, it's about the circumcision of the heart. Essentially, when Paul talks about that, he's really talking about the reality of this new covenant, the new covenant that Jeremiah spoke about. The Jeremiah covenant, which wasn't based in the circumcision of flesh, but the Jeremiah covenant, which was based in the circumcision of the heart, of the writing of the Torah on tablets of flesh, not on tablets of stone. Essentially, the tablets of stone there would refer to the ritualistic, old cultic version of Judaism. And the circumcision of the heart, the version of Judaism that comes out of Christ. Christianity, if you will. The Christianity that says that it's about relationship, about the Holy Spirit within, that changes the process of life. So we need to see that the Gentiles and what Gentiles did were very important to Jews. In fact, if you were Jewish and you walked on Gentile territory, it would make you unclean. And unclean meant that you couldn't then eat with people who were clean. You couldn't go to the temple. You couldn't be in the synagogue. You couldn't eat with your family. All those things made you unclean or ritually unclean. And the ritual uncleanness is then the problem that would affect your community action and the connections in community, which, as we've said before, was really the focus of the whole of Judaism. So therefore, to become unclean meant that you couldn't do the very thing that made you a Jew, to be part of your community. And that's why people avoided the Gentiles. They wouldn't talk to them, they wouldn't connect with them, they certainly wouldn't associate with them. A group that really was in the same boat then as the Gentiles, even though they were Jewish, were those who were tainted by Gentiles, or tainted by the fact of what their particular occupation was. And into that group then would fall the tax collectors and the prostitutes. The tax collectors and the prostitutes, by virtue either of their job or their associations, meant that they were really rejected out of normal society, out of normal community, because what they did or the people they associated with made them unclean. Essentially made them no better than the Gentiles. Therefore, outside of the covenant, outside of the blessing of God. What Jesus came to prove, though, and came to show, was that in fact what made us outside of the community of God was not our ethnicity, not our adherence to the cultic principles of Judaism, but what would set us outside of His community would be our lack of relationship with Him. And out of that relationship, our connection with each other. Jesus came to talk about a whole different level of inclusivity. Instead of dividing people between Jew and Gentile, rather seeing that we were all one in Him.